In the 7-day truce in the war between Israel and Hamas, 105 Israeli hostages, 240 Palestinian detainees were released. And there was an enormous increase in the amount of aid that was allowed into Gaza during that time. The truce ended nearly 5 days ago. Since then, the Israeli military incursion into Gaza has intensified. Now, back in October, at the start of this war, Israeli forces told people in Gaza who were in the north to move from the north to the south, and hundreds of thousands of people followed that order. About 1.9 people, over 80% of the population, the whole strip, have been displaced since the war began. Many ended up sheltering in the south. Now, Israel is expanding its military efforts in southern Gaza, including in Gaza's second largest city, Khan Yunis, leaving entire populations in Gaza with basically nowhere to go. This is raising enormous alarms about what the toll on civilians will be in this stage of the war. 16,000 people have already been killed, according to Gaza health officials, since the war began in October. Jeremy Konyndyk is the president of Refugees International. He previously served in the United States Agency for International Development under both President Biden and President Obama, worked on the COVID-19 response as well, and he joins me now. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Chris.
I want to read to you Refugees International statement. You guys fight for refugees worldwide. Obviously, the populations in both the West Bank and Gaza are refugees in an international legal sense. Yeah. They're now also internally displaced in Gaza. The renewed fighting takes place in the midst of a rapidly spiraling humanitarian catastrophe. There's growing likelihood of large-scale secondary mortality among displaced Palestinians. Basic services have been destroyed. Access to food and water withheld. The spread of disease is worsening. What's the sort of most pressing concern from your perspective here?
So we're seeing a pattern here that is very familiar to humanitarian experts. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator has warned that a much more hellish scenario is about to unfold, a public health emergency layered on top of the damage we're seeing so far. And the pattern we see is a few things. 80% displacement of the population, as you said earlier. Huge cuts in food availability. Only 10% of the food required to sustain the population has been getting in since the war started. Food prices are going up. WFP is warning now, Cindy McCain, the head of WFP, has warned the area is on the brink of famine, and we're starting to see spread of waterborne disease. And that is a cocktail that's very familiar to humanitarians. It's what tends to precede large-scale mortality in a famine or a severe humanitarian crisis.
I just want to be clear. I want to quote the World Food Program saying 8 weeks into the war is a high risk of famine for all the people of Gaza, especially for those with chronic diseases, older persons, children, those living with disabilities. The very high casualty toll, we think, again, according to the statistics we have, which come from the Gaza Health Ministry, as many as 6,000 children, possibly more. The vast majority, my understanding, are from direct result of Israeli airstrikes, bombardment, and mortars. Right. What you're saying is there's now a real possibility of this sort of secondary mortality.
Right. And when you look at something like, say, the famine in Somalia in 2011 that killed 250,000 people, those people weren't killed in fighting. They were killed because they died from the famine. And that's what, when you are weakened.
Precipitated by fighting.
Precipitated by the fighting, but also in that case by a drought, but a shortage of food. And here the shortage of food is man-made because it is mostly imported into Gaza, and that's been largely cut off since the war started.
The Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Army has put out these maps, and they almost look like, I don't know if we have one here, but they almost look like census tract maps, and they're very finely filigreed. Yeah. They have numbers. There's a place they tell folks in Gaza to go, I think online, if I'm not mistaken, to sort of find out what the direction is of where in this map to go. The Israeli government says we are going through tremendous pains to make these very fine distinctions about what's safe and what's not, so as to avoid civilian harm. Yeah. What do you think of that?
It's not a serious attempt to avoid civilian harm. It reads much more like an attempt to defer the blame for civilian harm onto the civilians rather than the IDF. It looks like the worst risk board you've ever seen in your life, and it's not a practical way to protect civilians. Every day, they are ordering new neighborhoods cleared out, ordering hundreds of thousands of new people to move, and they're pushing them further and further south into areas that are already badly overcrowded. It really does look like what the IDF is trying to do is sort of excuse then turning these areas into some version of almost a free fire zone. And in the way that some Israeli officials are talking about it, that's kind of how it sounds. You hear them when they are challenged, like Mark Regev was challenged by Jake Tapper the other day, their defense is, well, those people shouldn't have been where they are because we told them to move. But that's not how international law works. The way international law works is they still have to protect civilians even if they have ordered an evacuation.
You worked in the Biden administration. You worked in the Obama administration. Yeah. This administration has been very stalwart in support of Israel's war efforts here, support for the Netanyahu government, now the coalition unity government. As someone who personally worked in this administration, what do you think about that?
I think they are in a very hard spot, and it is partly a very hard spot of their own creation. I think they're very sincere in wanting to protect civilians in Gaza. I think they are not yet ready to recognize and to make some of the policy trade-offs that would entail. They want to have two things simultaneously. They want to support the Israeli military offensive and continue to arm it, equip it, and give it political and diplomatic backing. And at the same time, they want, and they have said, how Israel does that matters. And Israel needs to do that in a way that is in line with international law. And when senior administration officials are asked, well, is this in line with international law? They tie themselves in knots, not answering that question.
What would you say to that?
I would say, to all appearances, it is not.
Jeremy Konyndyk of Refugees International, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.